Hello everyone and welcome back to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and this week, being the launch week of Monstrosity Rampage on iOS and Android, the game that John and I have been working on, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the modern game and what we as a studio are looking at now that our game is in the wild. Monstrosity, like many other contemporary games, uses the games as a service business model, a relatively new philosophy in video game business that states that a game can be marketed and presented to a customer as not a single consumable product, but as a long-term interactive entertainment experience. I'd like to explain what that means today, as well as how we gauge the success of games using this model. I started out my career in video games when the console boom was still alive and well. One of the first games I worked on professionally was on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox when they were still in their prime. At that time in game history, we were nearing the end of a period that I like to call the packaged game era. A packaged game was a single video game experience, boxed and set on a store shelf that the player would pick up and play, and for better or worse, once the game was in the hand of consumers, it's largely out of the hands of the developers and publishers. Digital distribution, though existing on platforms like Steam for a few years prior, hadn't yet caught on to the extent that it has now. World of Warcraft offered a packaged product with regular patches and expansions, but by and large, games were a one-shot affair. They'd be developed, released to stores, then the product would largely be considered done, and you were likely to see a sequel, maybe an expansion, if any more content came out of the project. After the digital distribution explosion in the early 2010s and the subsequent indie renaissance, however, with the ability to seamlessly deliver content into an ongoing game, games have started leading further and further from that old one-and-done mentality of old game development into what's now referred to as the games as a service model, which states basically that the game is not a single one-time sale product anymore, but instead an entertainment experience which the player participates in and is subject to evolution and improvement over time. The most common form these sorts of games takes are multiplayer, whether synchronous or otherwise, in which players engage in some sort of competitive activity. The game facilitates this activity and, over its lifetime, creates a value-added proposition to the player by offering a long-term entertainment option that will continue to be updated throughout its life cycle. With traditional packaged games, the model was very simple and easy to track. From the moment of sale, each subsequent sold copy was worth a set amount of value. An install was a sale, and it was relatively easy to gauge the performance of a product by subtracting development costs at the time of Gold Master from sales post-launch. Some expansion and/or DLC development would often be included as an additional risk-reward vector into the late 2000s into the present, but ultimately the game was a discrete consumable object or series of discrete consumables. You pay, you play, we take home a paycheck at the end of the day. The transition away from the packaged product to games as a service has, however, provided some challenges to fully understanding the success of a product, if for no other reason than because the entire monetization process has evolved into a form that encourages monetization by the player in small pieces multiple times over the game's lifespan, and by a small minority of the player base. As developers, how do we gauge the performance of a game whose entire model presents sales as an option as opposed to a contract? Obviously, it's possible to simply just look at profits, but in the case of the games as a service model, the developer needs to be considering a long-term strategy. Games as a service pay out slowly, over time, and their development strategy relative to the likely return on investment needs to be different from what it once was. I'm going to offer a term now that I know that many of you who have dealt with the business side of any sort of product development might just wrinkle your noses at. KPIs, or Key Performance Indicators. If you aren't familiar with KPIs, in simple terms, they're individual statistics or metrics that are used to determine whether something is succeeding or not, particularly in the absence of more concrete success indicators like the pure sales of the packaged game era. There are a number of KPIs that we look at in the process of a game's post-launch, the most significant being acquisition, retention, and monetization. The main common factor between the old packaged game model and games as a service models is that of player acquisition. Without players, there can be no success, plain and simple. Traditionally, this is a simple number of units sold, which translates to a simple sale value. In the current service model, however, since the ultimate value of a player is significantly less concrete, it's only a single factor and is in a constant state of flux. In a saturated market, it's very important that in publishing we're extremely aware of our CPA, or cost per acquisition. This value is one that we'll compare many of our other metrics against to ensure that we aren't at risk of wasting money. For the service model, we look at two major factors typically for determining our game's population: daily active users, or DAU, and monthly active users, or MAU. These numbers fluctuate wildly, but in simple terms, it follows the number of players that are playing the game during any given time period, daily or monthly. In an ideal situation, everyone who installed your game would continue to play it forever, but the simple fact of the games market is that in the present day, especially in the free game market, players will download, launch, and eventually stop playing your game. Some will play for a long time, but for each of them, there are 9 more that will leave after the second session. The metric of player engagement is called retention, and the more players you have that are actively engaged with your game and continuing to play, the better your long-term performance will be. When a player stops playing the game and doesn't come back, that's referred to as churn. Accepting churn as a fact of free-to-play life, we measure these points of churn into 3 major milestones, referred to as Day 1, Day 7, and Day 30 retention. A generally accepted benchmark for a successful game using a service model is 40-20-10, meaning that 40% of players return after their first session, half of those players, or 20%, remain at the 1-week mark, and half of that again, or 10% of players, remain after playing the game for a month. The thought that only 10% in a good case of players in a game designed specifically to be a long-term play model actually spend any appreciable amount of time in the game might be alarming, but such is our business. Considering the saturation of the games market in the present day, much like with a YouTube video, not everyone will stay through to the end. The most important point is what you do with those players that do. We use the Day 30, 7, and 1 retention metrics as a barometer to see if our game is performing well from a gameplay standpoint. If these numbers are low, it means that players are losing interest in your game, becoming frustrated, or running out of things to do, all of which are extremely detrimental to our game's long-term health. If the numbers are consistently high after the inevitable initial churn, you can expect a strong showing as players show interest in continuing to play. But these loyal players, the 1 in 10 if you're playing your cards right, who are still playing your game a month in, are the ones who will become your loyal customers and may just, eventually, be willing to spend some of their hard-earned money on your game, provided the experience is worth it to them. When a player goes from being a regular free player to monetizing, that's called conversion. Conversion rate varies wildly year to year and country to country, but the average in 2016 in North America is roughly 2% of your player base, down from 5% 5 years ago. Note, however, that this is recorded from total users, so on average 1 in 5 loyal players in our 40-20-10 scenario has the potential to monetize at some capacity. To track these numbers, we tend to focus on the ARPU, or average revenue per user, and ARPPU, or average revenue per paid user. They're really fairly self-explanatory. We always want to know how much we're gaining for each player, or our ARPU, as this tells us how much value our game has. If we divide the ARPU over lifetime, that will tell us our lifetime value. We need the ARPU to exceed the cost that we're spending on user acquisition, or our CPA, or we'll be spending more money per player than we are making and getting them, which will put us in the red. We want to know how much each monetizing user is paying on average, which will tell us if the offerings we have are sufficient, if our pricing is reasonable, and perceived value of our product. The market average currently hovers around $24. By knowing the above simple KPIs, we can get a good understanding of how well or badly our games are performing, and we can also tailor our live ops to work to fit within the naturally occurring budget that comes from knowing these values. As a commercial game creator, being aware of these things and knowing how to action on them will be the difference between true success or failure, because though ignorance is bliss, it'll also bankrupt you. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you learned a little bit about how we measure metrics in a modern game under the Games as a Service model. Thank you very much for sticking with me into the end here, and if you liked what you saw, please think about checking some of the other content that we've got in our ThursDev or Serious Sunday series. We come out with new episodes weekly, but if you'd like to be notified when they become available, consider subscribing. It helps visibility for our shows on YouTube, and it helps you to keep track of us. It's win-win. And if I may commit one more act of shameless self-promotion before wrapping up our video today, Monstrosity Rampage is now available free on iOS and Android in most world regions. John and I have poured the last 2 years of our lives into this game, along with all my awesome coworkers at AlphaDog Games, and I would be thrilled if you would give it a try. Regardless, however, thank you once again for joining me today, and I hope that you enjoyed the rest of your Thursday, or whatever day you happen to be watching this on. Take care.